In the fall of 1878, while every other homesteader in the Broken River Valley was buying rich bottomland and plowing black loam, Mark Tavish spent his last dollar on 40 acres of razor-sharp lava rock that the land office had listed as worthless. His neighbors called it a fool's purchase, but Mark had noticed something the surveyors missed: pale curls of steam rising from cracks in the stone every morning. The same dead ground was breathing. And if he was right, that volcanic heat might just turn the most useless land in the territory into the only farm that could laugh at a killing winter. Mark Tavish was 34 years old, with a pregnant wife and a young son. They had already buried 2 children on the frontier. They lost their last farm to drought, and the 40 acres of razor basalt was their final desperate gamble. While neighbors called him mad, Mark walked barefoot across the steam vents every morning, feeling the earth's warmth rising through the cracks. He had no formal training, no money for glass or timber, but he believed that if he could trap that volcanic heat, he could grow food straight through the harshest winter, and the first killing frost was only weeks away. The first thing Mark Tavish did after signing the deed was walk the boundaries of his 40 acres, counting steam vents. Not crops, not fence posts, not timber. He counted the pale wisps rising from the stone. He found 11 distinct vents across that jagged field, most clustered near the southern slope where the lava rock had cracked heaviest. One of them, a narrow fissure running nearly 12 feet along a basalt shelf, breathed steady warmth that fogged the air even on cold mornings. Mark knelt and pressed his bare hand flat against the rock. It was hot enough to sting. Hot enough to make a grown man forget the bitter October wind cutting across his neck. His wife, Lisa, watched from the wagon with their boy, Samuel, who had just turned 6. She did not understand why Mark had traded their last good horses for this broken ground. The land agent had all but laughed when Mark handed over the money. The soil depth across most of the parcel was less than 3 inches. Below that lay solid volcanic glass, sharp enough to shred a leather boot. No water, no grass, no timber. Worthless. That word followed them into town at every supply run. But Mark had spent 3 nights camped on that land before buying it. He did not sleep much. He wandered the lava field with a candle lantern, studying where the steam rose thickest and where the wind stripped it away. He had seen something the land agent never bothered to notice. The air temperatures around those vents stayed nearly 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding valley floor. Even at midnight, even after a light frost had silvered the sagebrush beyond the property line, the ground over the vents remained bare and steaming. He could grow winter vegetables directly above them, if he could channel the heat. The true gamble was invisible. Mark believed there was an enormous heat source below him, the remnant of ancient volcanic activity that had formed the lava beds long before the first settlers arrived. He could not prove it. He had no drilling equipment, no geological training. He only had his hands and a stubborn conviction that the earth itself was offering him a furnace. If he could learn to trap it, he might harvest food while every other homesteader in the region starved over the winter months. Maybe. But if he was wrong, they would freeze or starve themselves, with no money left and no way out. The cabin that stood on the claim was little more than a one-room shack built by a previous squatter who had abandoned it. The walls were thin and the roof leaked. Mark spent his first week patching the roof with tar-soaked canvas and stacking loose lava rock around the base to block the wind. Samuel helped gather stones, his small hands growing calloused. Lisa, heavy with child, could not lift much. She sat on a wooden crate inside the cabin and sewed blankets from old wool clothes while listening to the wind scream through the cracks. She worried constantly. She had lost 2 bobbies to fever and hunger on their last farm. The fear lived deep inside her, a colder thing than any Dakota winter. But even in that drafty shack, she noticed something strange. The corner near the window was inexplicably warm. Mark had positioned the cabin deliberately over a vent that hissed faintly through a crack in the floor stones. He covered it with a grate made from an old wagon wheel rim. Mild heat seeped upward all night. It was not enough to warm the whole room, but it kept the frost from forming on that wall. Lisa would sit there whenever the baby kicked hardest, letting the invisible warmth ease her back. She never said it aloud, but she began to believe just a little. The nearest ranch belonged to a man named Elias Boggs, an old mountain trapper turned cattleman who had spent 40 winters in the high country. He rode over one afternoon to see what fool had bought the lava plains. He found Mark digging a trench line with a pickaxe, sweat steaming off his shoulders despite the cold. Elias sat on his horse and watched for a long time before speaking. "Steam fields make good stories for newspaper men," he finally said. "They don't make good farms." Mark kept swinging the pick. Elias watched a while longer, then spat into the dust and rode away. He had seen men chase hot air before, and it always ended the same way. But Mark was not chasing hot air. He was building a steam trap. He dug shallow channels from the main fissure toward the flat ground where he planned to erect a greenhouse. The channels were lined with flat lava slabs fitted tightly together. Over the top he laid a mixture of wet clay, sand, and chopped straw. Once dried, it formed a crude but airtight seal. The vent's breath traveled through these channels underground, emerging through a clay chimney at the far end. With a canvas flap he could direct the flow. He tested it a dozen times, watching the steam curl upward exactly where he wanted. The greenhouse would sit directly above that warm mouth. Building a glass greenhouse was impossible. Glass cost money he did not have. So Mark built walls from stone and scrap timber, using a frame of lodgepole pine hauled from a creek bed 2 miles away. For the roof, he stretched 3 layers of oiled canvas over a pitched frame, leaving a south-facing slope to catch what little sun the winter offered. The steam would rise inside the enclosure and keep temperatures above freezing even at night. He could plant potatoes, carrots, and winter cabbage in raised beds filled with soil hauled bucket by bucket from the river bottom. Samuel helped carry the dirt in an old wheelbarrow that squealed with every revolution. The work drew more eyes. Other settlers in the valley had heard about the steam fields. A few rode over to satisfy their curiosity. They saw a man breaking his back over stone, building something that looked like a tent attached to a chimney. They saw a pregnant wife hanging laundry on a rope beside a shack made of salvaged boards. They saw a thin boy carrying dirt. Most of them shook their heads and said nothing. But one afternoon, a man named Royce Calder, who owned a prosperous wheat operation 6 miles east, stopped his wagon directly beside the trench line. He did not laugh. He was 36 years old, solidly built, with the confidence of a man who had never lost a good harvest. "You know what the Geological Survey reported about this ground?" Royce asked. Mark straightened, one hand resting on the pick handle. Royce pointed toward the steaming fissure. "That heat comes from a lava tube system that collapsed maybe 5,000 years ago. It's stable now. But if another collapse happens underground, those vents could seal shut overnight. You'd have nothing. No heat, no steam, no crop." Mark looked down at the steam curling through the channel. Then he looked back at Royce. "I know," he said. Royce waited for more, but Mark offered nothing else. He simply returned to digging. The first true cold snap hit the Broken River Valley on the 22nd of October. The temperature dropped to 17 degrees overnight. Ice clawed across every water trough north of the ridge. Sagebrush crackled underfoot by morning. In town, a few men reported finding frozen birds on the ground beneath their roosts. Mark woke in darkness to the sound of Samuel crying. The fire had burned low. Frost had crept across the floorboards in the north corner, but the south corner near the vent grate remained clear. He rebuilt the fire quickly. Lisa pulled the blankets tighter around Samuel and said nothing, but her eyes followed Mark as he pulled on his coat and went outside. The greenhouse stood dark against the gray dawn. Mark untied the canvas flap and stepped inside. For a moment his heart stopped. The air felt cold. He could see his breath. His shallow wooden planting boxes were crusted with a thin frost. The plants inside, tiny green shoots of winter cabbage he had nurtured for weeks, were frozen. The steam channel had worked perfectly all through the testing, but something had changed overnight. Mark crouched beside the clay chimney and held his palm over the opening. Nothing. The warm breath had stopped. He scrambled outside, following the trench line with a lantern until he reached the main fissure. The ground was still warm, but the steam was not rising. Water had seeped into the lava crack from the cold and condensed, forming an ice plug deep below. The Earth's furnace had been blocked by frozen groundwater, and the real winter had not even begun. Mark knelt in the frozen mud beside the fissure, feeling the cold radiating out of the ground where steam should have been. His lantern flickered in the bitter wind. He pried a loose lava slab from the trench and lowered his hand into the dark crack. The air below was dead. Not warm, not moving. Just wet and cold, seeping up like the breath of something buried. The ice plug was somewhere deeper, maybe 8 feet down, maybe further. If he could not reach it and clear it by nightfall, the greenhouse would freeze again. Every seed he had planted would die, and his family's entire winter plan would fail before the first true snowflakes ever touched this ground. He called for Samuel to bring the rope and the long-handled iron bar. The boy ran barefoot across the frost, his feet already tough as shoe leather. Lisa appeared in the cabin doorway wrapped in her wool blanket, watching without a word. She had seen that expression on Mark's face before, the one that meant he would not come back inside until something was fixed or broken beyond repair. She did not try to stop him. She simply closed the door softly against the wind and knelt beside the stove to pray. Mark tied the rope around his waist and fed the other end through the largest lava boulder near the fissure. He would not risk falling permanently into the crack. The opening was narrow, barely wider than his shoulders. He lowered himself feet first, the iron bar gripped in one hand, lantern looped to his belt. The rock walls scraped against his coat as he descended into the dark. The cold deepened with every inch. At 7 feet down, his boots met wet stone. At 9 feet, he found the ice. It was a solid plug, nearly 2 feet thick frozen meltwater that had seeped down during the October rains and then hardened when the cold snapped. It glistened in the lantern light like a thick glass window laid flat across a well. Beneath it, he could see the faint steam rising from deeper channels, but the ice held it back completely. Mark braced himself against the narrow walls and swung the iron bar. The sound echoed upward like a hammer striking a frozen lake. Cracks spread across the surface, but the plug held. He swung again, and again. His shoulders burned. The cold bit through his gloves until his fingers went numb. Above him, the daylight was a pale gray rectangle filled with Samuel's anxious face. Minutes crawled into an hour. Lisa could hear the dull clang of iron on ice echoing beneath the cabin floor. She did not know whether her husband was winning or slowly freezing to death in a stone throat. Then suddenly, a deep crack split the air, followed by a wet gush. Steam exploded upward through the fissure in a white plume, carrying the smell of wet rock and some deeper mineral odor, ancient and sharp. Mark scrambled upward, coughing, soaked to the skin but alive. The vent was breathing again, hotter than before, as if the ice blockage had built pressure behind it. The clay chimney over the greenhouse roared back to life within minutes. The frost inside the planting boxes began to drip away. That night Mark did not sleep. He sat beside the greenhouse, wrapped in a buffalo robe, watching the steam curl gently into the enclosure where the tiny cabbage shoot stood upright and green. He had learned his first true lesson. The underground heat was not passive. It was a living system, temperamental and dangerous, and it could be killed just like any crop. If he did not understand it completely, it would fail him again. Maybe at the exact moment his family needed it most. The next morning, Mark began redesigning the steam network from scratch. The single trench was no longer enough. If another ice plug formed, he needed a backup. He studied the layout of the 11 vents across his claim like a doctor mapping arteries. He noticed something he had overlooked before. 2 vents on the eastern slope never produced steam in the early mornings. They only breathed warmth after sunrise, when the ground had absorbed enough heat to drive the condensation away. They were too shallow, too cold. But a third vent far up the northern ridge produced steam constantly, even on the coldest nights. Its source had to be much deeper than the others, maybe tapping directly into the same lava tube system that Royce Calder had warned was unstable. If that vent ever sealed shut, the whole farm goes dark. But if he could connect it to the main fissure with a second trench, the system would have a redundancy. He could open or close clay gates to direct flow from either source. He began digging the second channel that afternoon, packing out the trench line himself, marking the shallow curves with loose stones. Samuel walked beside him again, carrying the measuring rope. The work was brutal. Solid basalt resisted the pickaxe as if the earth itself were trying to push him away. His hands blistered, bled, and then blistered again. His back screamed at him each night. But by the end of the first week of November, the second channel was complete. He tested it the following morning. Just before dawn, he plugged the main fissure channel with a tightly packed clay stopper and opened the northern gate. For one terrifying moment, nothing happened. The greenhouse chimney remained silent. Then a thin wisp of steam appeared, then a steady breath, hot and strong. The northern vent was working. Mark stood in the freezing darkness, lantern raised, watching steam curl into the canvas roof, and for the first time since the ice plug, he allowed himself a small, quiet exhale. The greenhouse began producing almost immediately. The winter cabbage thrived. The potato shoots broke soil within 2 weeks. Carrots grew slowly but steadily in the raised beds. Lisa transplanted hardy herbs into clay pots along the warmest wall, and they lived. The structure was not beautiful. The canvas roof sagged under its own weight, the stone walls were uneven, and the air inside always smelled faintly of damp earth and sulfur. But it was alive. And in a valley where every other growing thing had frozen to death, that was a miracle. Royce Calder returned in mid-November, riding up the trail with 2 hired hands behind him. He had heard rumors that Mark's strange canvas tent was producing green shoots. He did not believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. Mark led him inside the greenhouse without a word. Roy stood there, a successful wheat farmer worth 10 times what Mark owned, staring at rows of live vegetables growing in a lava field. The steam curled around his boots. The air inside was 50 degrees warmer than the outside air. He touched a cabbage leaf, still wet from morning moisture, and it did not shatter in his fingers. Royce looked at Mark, then at the clay chimney, then back at the plants. For a long moment he could not speak. "How many vents do you have?" he finally asked. Mark told him 11. Royce shook his head slowly. He had read the geological survey of this basin years ago. Nothing in it mentioned usable geothermal heat. The surveyors had cataloged the steam as a curiosity, not an agricultural resource. They had missed everything. Mark had not missed it, and that one difference meant he was growing food while other homesteaders were already rationing their stores. Within a week, word spread. A reporter from the Broken River Gazette, a thin man named Hiram Cotter, traveled out to the claim and interviewed Mark for nearly 2 hours. He sketched the greenhouse layout in his notepad, measured the temperature inside versus outside, and collected soil samples. On November 18th, the Gazette published a front-page story under the headline, "The Farm That Winter Cannot Kill." The article described Mark's claim as the most unusual agricultural experiment in territorial history. It speculated about the deep heat source and concluded that if this system could be replicated, the entire northern frontier might one day grow food through January. The article reached Boise, it reached Cheyenne, and it reached the desk of Dr. Harlan Webb, the territorial geologist for the entire Western Survey, a man whose professional reputation rested on knowing exactly what lay beneath every acre of the public domain. Dr. Webb was not the kind of man who believed newspaper stories. He sent a telegraph to the Broken River Valley within 3 days. He was coming to examine the claim personally. He arrived on the 1st of December in a government wagon pulled by 4 mules, accompanied by a cartographer and a young assistant. Dr. Webb was 53 years old, gray-bearded, with spectacles that pinched the bridge of his nose and a voice that never wasted words. He walked the entire 40 acres for 6 hours, mapping every vent, taking temperature readings, measuring steam pressure with a primitive gauge, and chipping rock samples into canvas bags. Mark followed him in silence, answering questions when asked. Lisa offered the men coffee, which they accepted wordlessly on the cabin porch while snow began falling lightly over the valley. Dr. Webb's assistant wrote constantly in a leather journal. At dusk, Dr. Webb stood beside the greenhouse chimney and watched the steam rise against the darkening sky. He asked Mark to describe the ice plug incident in detail. Mark told him everything: how the main fissure had sealed, how he had dug down 9 feet and broken the plug with an iron bar, how the northern vent had become the emergency backup. Dr. Webb listened without interruption, then removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly with a cloth. When he spoke, His voice was very quiet, as if he were still thinking through the words. "Mr. Tavish," he said, "this is not merely a convenient steam field. The heat you are tapping originates from a magma body that lies no more than 2,000 feet below this basin. According to all the surface indicators, this is a collapsed caldera remnant from the last major period of volcanic activity in this region, roughly 4,000 years ago. The steam is produced by groundwater interacting with superheated rock. You are standing on top of an enormous thermal reservoir that is likely stable for another 10,000 years." Mark did not fully understand the geology, but he understood the word stable. Dr. Webb's assistant looked up from his journal. The geologist continued, "There is no other working farm in the entire territory that uses geothermal heat for cultivation. None. I have surveyed every known vent field west of the Missouri River, and I have never encountered any settler who recognized the agricultural potential of this resource. You are, without exaggeration, the first." Dr. Webb paused, then added something that Mark would remember for the rest of his life. "You are farming heat from an ancient volcano, Mr. Tavish. The report I write will say exactly that." The report was published in the Territorial Records on December 10th. It declared Mark Tavish's claim to be the sole documented geothermal farm in the Western Territories, a site of unusual scientific interest and potential long-term agricultural value. The report estimated that with proper infrastructure, the steam could heat multiple greenhouses, a residential building, and livestock water troughs simultaneously. It recommended that the government study the site further as a model for frontier settlement in volcanic regions. The farm's value, once near zero, suddenly became incalculable. The previous owner of that 40 acres, a man named Thaddeus Crane, read the report in a Cheyenne hotel room on December 17th. Crane was a land speculator who had acquired the lava field sight unseen through a county tax seizure years earlier, and then sold it to Mark for pennies, believing he had swindled a desperate fool. The revelation that the land held a stable geothermal reservoir capable of sustaining agriculture through winter struck him like a physical blow. For 3 straight days, he did nothing but drink and reread the newspaper clippings. Then he hired a lawyer. On December 22nd, a county marshal arrived at Mark's cabin and handed him a legal summons. Thaddeus Crane was suing for reversal of the sale, claiming fraudulent concealment. The lawsuit alleged that Mark had knowingly withheld the value of the geothermal resource at the time of purchase. If the court ruled in Crane's favor, Mark would lose the claim, the greenhouse, the cabin, and every improvement he had made. He would be thrown off the land with his pregnant wife and son in the dead of winter. The summons demanded his appearance at the territorial courthouse on January 5th. The marshal tipped his hat, climbed back onto his horse, and rode away, leaving Mark standing in the snow with the paper trembling in his hand. That night, as a hard wind screamed across the lava field and steam rose steady through the greenhouse chimney, Mark Tavish realized that the coldest thing he would face this winter was not the frozen groundwater, not the blizzard, not even the killing frost. It was a legal battle that could strip him of everything he had built before spring ever arrived. Lisa saw the paper in his hand as soon as he stepped through the door. She did not ask what it said. She could read it on his face, the same way she had learned to read weather before a hard frost. Mark laid the summons on the table beside the cold coffee cup. Samuel looked up from the corner where he was stacking kindling, his eyes wide. The word courthouse meant nothing to him yet, but the silence in the cabin told him everything. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the steam vent beneath the floor grate kept its steady warm breath, a quiet reminder that the land was alive. And now someone wanted to take it away. Mark had 3 weeks until the hearing. He owned no suit, no legal books, no money for a lawyer. The county seat was a 2-day ride through open country, and the January winds could kill a man on horseback if he was careless. Thaddeus Crane had hired a firm from Cheyenne, a man named Alton J. Sprague, who had won 17 land disputes in the last 5 years and bragged about it in every saloon between here and the Missouri. Mark had nothing but his calloused hands, his wife's steady gaze, and the truth. He did not know if that would be enough. Royce Calder arrived on the morning of December 27th, his wagon loaded with firewood and a side of smoked pork. He did not knock. He pushed open the cabin door and set the meat on the table. Word of the lawsuit had spread through the valley faster than any newspaper. Royce had spent his own winters fighting boundary disputes, and he knew what a wealthy speculator could do to a poor man in a courtroom. He told Mark that he would testify on his behalf, that every homesteader in the Broken River Valley could confirm the land had been considered worthless, but that might not matter if the judge was crooked or the law was applied cold. Mark thanked him but asked the hardest question: what happens to Lisa and the children if I lose? Royce did not have an answer. Dr. Harlan Webb returned on his own initiative 3 days before the hearing. He had already submitted his geological report to the territorial office, but he understood that a lawsuit could twist scientific findings into something unrecognizable. He sat with Mark in the greenhouse, where winter cabbage leaves glistened under the canvas roof, and explained exactly what he intended to say in court. The geothermal reservoir was unknown to any surveyor before Mark's discovery. The steam vents had been noted only as a minor curiosity, not as a resource with any agricultural application. Mark had not concealed value, he had created it. Dr. Webb looked at the green rose and said quietly, "The earth gave you a warm crack in the ground. You turned it into a farm. That distinction matters." Mark nodded, but he also knew that distinctions could be erased by a clever lawyer. The wagon ride to Broken River began before dawn on January 4th, under a sky heavy with unshed snow. Lisa could not travel in her condition. She remained at the cabin with Samuel, a neighbor woman staying with them in case the baby came early. Mark rode beside Royce Calder, with Dr. Webb following in his government wagon. The road wound through frozen sagebrush and patches of black ice. Nobody spoke much. The cold burned at their faces, and the wind carried the smell of distant snow. Mark watched the horizon the way a condemned man watches the gallows. He had survived thirst, drought, the death of 2 children, and an ice plug 8 feet beneath frozen stone. But a courtroom filled with strangers and law books felt more dangerous than any of it. The town of Broken River was a single muddy street lined with clapboard buildings and a courthouse built of squared timber. By the time Mark's party arrived, the boarding houses were already full. Speculators, newspapermen, and curious farmers had gathered to watch the case. Hiram Cotter from the Gazette sat in the front row of the public gallery with a fresh notepad. Thaddeus Crane stood near the courthouse steps in a dark wool coat, smoking a thin cigar, flanked by his Cheyenne attorney Alton Sprague. Crane was 51 years old, with the soft hands of a man who had never swung a pickaxe. He watched Mark climb down from the wagon with the faint smile of someone who believed he had already won. The hearing began at 10 o'clock the next morning. Judge Ephraim Bollinger presided, a thin man with deep-set eyes and a reputation for reading the law exactly as it was written, no more, no less. The courtroom smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. Mark sat at the defendant's table without an attorney, a single folder of handwritten notes in front of him. Royce Calder and Dr. Webb waited in the gallery. The window glass fogged from the breathing of 60 people packed shoulder to shoulder. Outside, the snow began to fall, light at first, then thicker. Alton Sprague spoke for nearly an hour. He painted Mark as a cunning opportunist who had researched the lava field before purchase, who had walked the ground and seen the steam vents, and who had deliberately withheld that knowledge from the seller to acquire the land at a fraction of its true value. He called it fraudulent concealment, a violation of the Territorial Property Code. He cited a case from 1872 in which a mineral spring was ruled a known asset that the seller was entitled to compensation for. He held up Dr. Webb's report and read aloud the words "stable thermal reservoir capable of year-round agriculture," then turned to the judge and said, "The defendant knew this heat existed. He understood its value before he paid $1. He stole that value from my client." Mark gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. When Mark finally stood to speak, his voice was rough and low, the voice of a man more comfortable with a hammer than a speech. He did not argue law, he told a story. He described the day he first camped on the lava field, how he counted steam vents with a candle lantern, and how no surveyor, no land agent, not even the Territorial Geological Office had ever classified that heat as an agricultural resource. He had bought the land because he was desperate, because it was the only ground he could afford, because no one else wanted it. He built the greenhouse with his own hands and his young son's small help. He learned how to channel steam by trial and error, nearly losing everything when the ice plug formed. He turned worthless stone into growing food. If that was fraud, he said quietly, then every man who ever worked hard ground with his own sweat was a criminal. Royce Calder testified next. He described the day he first saw Mark digging trenches with steam rising off his shoulders, and how the whole valley had considered the land utterly useless. He told the court that the price Mark paid was the same price any other fool might have paid for graveyard rock. The steam was not a hidden treasure. It was a curiosity until Mark made it something more. Dr. Harlan Webb's testimony carried the weight of the territorial government. He explained that the Geological Survey of 1875 had catalogued the lava field steam vents as a thermal anomaly of no economic significance. No known precedent existed for their agricultural use. Mark Tavish, he said, had not discovered a hidden mine or a secret spring of known value. He had invented an entirely new form of farming. The value was not in the ground when he bought it. The value was created after. Sprague cross-examined him aggressively, asking if the lava tube system itself was known before the sale. Dr. Webb replied that thermal activity was known, but its agricultural potential was not. Sprague pushed. Could another scientist have recognized it? Dr. Webb paused. Possibly, he admitted, but no one did. That admission hung in the air like smoke. The worst moment came when Sprague called a surprise witness, an old prospector named Silas Kerr, who had filed a mineral claim on the lava field 12 years earlier and then abandoned it. Kerr testified that he had felt warm ground while digging, that he had noted it in his claim journal as curious steam. Sprague produced the journal page, yellowed but legible, and read the line aloud. Warm vapor issues from the rock, ground bare in winter. He argued that this proved the geothermal feature was known and recorded long before Mark's purchase, and that the previous owner, Crane, had never been informed of this journal. The courtroom stirred. Mark's stomach turned cold. He had never heard of Silas Kerr. If the judge believed this journal constituted prior knowledge, the case could crumble. Judge Bollinger recessed the court for 2 hours to review the journal and the legal precedents. Mark sat in the cold hallway on a wooden bench, his head in his hands. Snow piled against the windows. Royce brought him coffee, but he could not drink it. Dr. Webb stood by the door, staring at nothing, recalculating the legal interpretation of his own testimony. If the court ruled that thermal activity with any record constituted known value, then the whole doctrine of frontier land purchases could shift. And Mark would lose not only his farm, but also the idea that a man could make something out of nothing. When the court reconvened, Judge Bollinger did not waste words. He read the journal passage again, then placed it on his desk. He spoke slowly. The law does not protect value that no one could reasonably have recognized. Mr. Kerr felt warm ground, but he never farmed it. He never built a greenhouse. He never grew a crop. The Territorial Survey saw steam, but they called it a curiosity. None of them understood what Mr. Tavish understood. The geothermal resource was lying dormant in plain sight, and it took the labor, ingenuity, and risk of this defendant to transform it into something of agricultural value. The court finds no fraudulent concealment. The sale stands. Judgment for the defendant. The gallery erupted, but Mark did not cheer. He simply closed his eyes and let the breath leave his body in a long, shaking exhale. Thaddeus Crane sat stunned, his face gray. Alton Sprague folded his papers without a word. The same snow that was piling against the windows had already cost him a case he had been certain of winning. Within weeks, Crane would be bankrupt, undone by his own legal fees and the collapse of his reputation. But the real twist was still ahead, and it would end in a way that no one in that courtroom could have predicted. Because Mark Tavish did not just keep his farm that winter. He kept it so well that the very man who tried to steal it would eventually have to beg him for a job. The ride back to the claim took 2 full days through deepening snow. Mark sat in the wagon beside Royce Calder, while Dr. Webb followed in his government wagon behind them. The January wind cut sideways across the basin, but Mark barely felt it. He kept his coat collar turned up and his eyes fixed on the pale horizon, turning the judge's words over in his mind. The sale stands. Not a victory he had won with clever arguments, but a reprieve granted by the truth. The land was his. The greenhouse stood. Lisa and Samuel were waiting. And somewhere below the frozen lava rock, the ancient heat that had nearly been stolen from him still breathed, steady as a heartbeat. Lisa saw the wagon from the cabin window on the afternoon of the 6th. She had been watching the trail for 2 days, barely sleeping, one hand resting on the heavy curve of her belly, the other clutching a wool shawl around her shoulders. When she saw Mark climb down from the wagon and walk toward the door, she did not run to him. She could not. The baby had dropped lower and her back ached with the deep, dull pain of late pregnancy. But she opened the door before he touched it and stood there in the cold, her face pale and exhausted, her eyes wet. He did not speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her as gently as he could and held her against his chest while the wind pushed snow across the porch boards. Samuel appeared behind her, clutching a piece of kindling, and Mark pulled him into the embrace too. They had won. The farm changed after that winter. The court case had made Mark Tavish a public figure without his consent. Hiram Cotter's articles in the Gazette had already spread the story of the steam-heated greenhouse, but after the trial, newspapers across the territory picked it up. The Cheyenne Daily Sun ran a long piece titled "The Steam Farmer of Broken River." A small magazine in Chicago reprinted Dr. Webb's geological report alongside a sketch of the greenhouse. Letters arrived from as far away as Ohio, some asking for advice, others offering to buy the land for sums that made Mark's head spin. He answered none of the offers to sell. He answered every letter asking for advice, writing slowly by candlelight with a carpenter's pencil, explaining the layout of the steam channels, the danger of ice plugs, the importance of backup vents. He had never intended to become a teacher, but the frontier had a way of turning survivors into instructors. The greenhouse itself expanded. By late January, Mark had doubled its size, adding a second canvas-covered bay heated by a new clay chimney connected to the northern vent. The winter cabbage continued producing. The potatoes grew thick and starchy. He added leeks, turnips, and a row of hardy herbs that Lisa used to flavor their stews. The air inside the enclosure was always humid, thick with the smell of damp soil and the faint mineral bite of volcanic steam. Samuel spent hours inside, carrying water buckets, pulling weeds, learning to read the plants the way his father read the vents. The boy's hands grew brown at the knuckles from the dirt, and his voice picked up the same quiet, measured cadence as his father's. He was becoming a farmer of hot stone, just like the old man. The greenhouse was not the only thing warmed by the vents. Mark had run a third steam channel from the main fissure directly beneath the cabin floor, building a shallow crawlspace lined with flat lava slabs. The warm air rose through gaps in the floorboards, and for the first time since they had come west, the Tavish home stayed warm all night without burning half a cord of wood. Frost stopped forming on the inside walls. Lisa could walk across the floor barefoot in the middle of a blizzard. She wept the first time she realized it, not from gratitude but from memory. Her first 2 children had died of fever in a drafty sod house where the cold never left the corners. She had buried them in frozen ground with a shovel too heavy for her hands, and now she was standing on stone warmed by the earth itself, carrying a child who might actually survive. The baby arrived on February 12th, a daughter, born in the warmth of the cabin with the steam vent hissing softly beneath the floor. Lisa's labor was long but not dangerous. A midwife from the valley settlement made it in time, riding through the snow on a mule, and found the cabin so warm she removed her coat within minutes. Mark waited outside with Samuel, packing in the snow, watching the steam rise from the greenhouse chimney like a signal. When the midwife opened the door and called him inside, he saw Lisa propped against blankets, exhausted but smiling, and a small pink infant wrapped in wool against her chest. They named her Anna. She was the first child born in that cabin, and she would survive, healthy and loud-lunged, because the ancient volcano beneath their feet had given her a gift no frontier doctor could provide: steady warmth through a killing season. Thaddeus Crane was not so fortunate. The legal fees from the failed lawsuit had devoured his remaining assets, and his reputation as a speculator was ruined. No bank in Cheyenne would lend to him. No land office would sell to him without full payment in advance. His Cheyenne attorney, Sprague, dropped him as a client after the trial, leaving him to settle a mountain of court costs alone. By March, Crane had sold his last holdings for a fraction of their value. By April, he was living in a rented room above a livery stable in Broken River, scraping work, cleaning tack, and mucking stalls. The man who had once swindled desperate settlers out of their last dollars was now a hired hand at a stable, sleeping above the smell of horses and hay. He did not come to Mark's farm immediately. Pride held him back for months, but hunger and poverty eroded pride faster than any sermon. In late May, with the prairie grass greening and the steam vents still breathing their endless warmth, Thaddeus Crane rode a borrowed mule up the long trail to the Tavish claim. He wore the same dark coat from the courthouse, now frayed at the cuffs and patched at the elbows. His face had thinned. His hands, once soft, were cracked from stable work. He dismounted slowly and stood at the edge of the greenhouse, staring at the rows of vegetables growing in what he had once dismissed as worthless stone. Mark saw him from the cabin and walked out alone. He did not bring a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there in the spring wind, waiting. Crane spoke first, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar with humility. He said that he had been wrong. He said that he had tried to steal something he never understood. He said that he had nothing left, no land, no money, no reputation, and he asked, with visible pain, if there was any work on the farm, any work at all. Mark looked at him for a long time, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, long enough for Crane to understand exactly what it felt like to be judged by a man he had once tried to destroy. Then Mark nodded once and pointed toward the wood pile. "The axe is behind the shed," he said. "Start splitting." Crane blinked, then walked slowly toward the shed, removed his coat, and picked up the axe. The sound of wood splitting echoed across the lava field for the rest of the afternoon. Thaddeus Crane spent the next 3 years as a hired hand on the farm he had once sued to steal. He never again spoke of the lawsuit. He never again gambled on land he had not walked with his own feet. And late one evening, while the steam rose from the greenhouse chimney and the first stars appeared above the ridge, he told Samuel that he had been wealthy once, but had never actually owned anything that mattered. The boy did not fully understand, but he remembered the words. Dr. Harlan Webb returned in the summer of 1879 with a full survey team. They spent 6 weeks mapping the underground heat reservoir, measuring steam temperatures, and testing soil chemistry. Webb published a second report that year, far longer than the first, which formally designated the Tavish claim as the sole documented geothermal farming operation in the Western Territories. He recommended that the government study similar lava fields in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana for potential agricultural applications. The report included detailed diagrams of Mark's trench and chimney system, complete with annotations explaining the backup vent layout and the ice plug prevention method. Mark's name appeared 17 times in that report. A man who could not read a geological survey had become the primary source for one. Over the following winters, other settlers began appearing at the claim with notebooks and questions. Some were desperate farmers who had lost too much to the cold. Others were young men with no land of their own, hopping to learn a trade. A few were simply curious. Mark never turned any of them away. He walked them through the vents, explained the steam channels, and warned them about the ice plugs, the shifting ground, the constant need to read the heat like a living thing. He made no speeches. He sold no books. He just showed them the same way he had shown himself, by digging, failing, and digging again. By the end of the 1880s, at least 4 other geothermal greenhouses had been built in the territory using his methods, and a handful of farmers in colder climates were experimenting with steam-heated troughs for livestock water. The idea was spreading, quietly, beneath the surface, like heat through lava rock. But the most surprising detail was yet to emerge, and it would change how the world remembered Mark Tavish. In 1902, more than 2 decades after the trial, a geological survey team using new magnetometry equipment discovered that the magma body beneath the Broken River Basin was far larger than anyone had realized. It was not a single collapsed caldera, but an interconnected network of 3 magma chambers stretching across nearly 16 square miles, all feeding heat upward through the same fractured basalt layer that Mark had tapped with his trenches. The original survey of 1875 had completely missed it. The steam vents Mark had counted with a candle lantern that first night were the only surface expression of one of the largest shallow geothermal fields in North America. Dr. Webb, long retired, wrote a final letter to Mark's son Samuel in which he admitted that Mark Tavish had not discovered a farm. He had discovered an entire subterranean heat ocean, and he had drained it with nothing but a pickaxe, a lantern, and a stubborn belief that the earth was offering him a furnace. Mark did not live to read that letter. He died in the winter of 1899 at the age of 55, inside the same cabin on the same warm floor where his children had been born. The steam vent beneath the floor grate still breathed when he passed, as it had every winter night for more than 20 years. He was buried on the claim, on a low rise overlooking the greenhouse, where the ground was too hard for other graves but soft enough for his, because the heat came close to the surface there. Lisa outlived him by 6 years. Samuel kept the farm running until the Great War, when he left to serve and never returned. The land eventually passed out of the family, but the name Tavish remained on county records and geological maps for decades afterward. And on cold winter mornings, long after the last canvas roof had rotted away and the last chimney had crumbled, travelers crossing the Broken River Basin could still see faint curls of steam rising from cracks in the lava rock, breathing warmth into the air as they had on the morning Mark Tavish first knelt and pressed his bare hand against the stone and understood what no one else had seen. The coldest ground can hide the greatest heat, and sometimes the most worthless thing in the world is simply the thing no one has learned to value yet. The story of Mark Tavish has a strange way of following you long after the last steam curl fades from the page. You might drive past a stretch of black lava rock in eastern Idaho or northern Nevada and see nothing but waste ground, unworthy of a second glance. But now you know better. You know that beneath the surface, there could be an ancient furnace still burning, waiting for someone stubborn enough to feel the warmth and ask the right question. The frontier was never just about finding what was there. It was about recognizing what no one else could see. Mark Tavish didn't stake his claim on gold or timber or rich bottomland. He staked it on a whisper of steam and the dangerous belief that the earth itself might be his ally. That took more than courage. It took a kind of intelligence that can't be taught in any schoolroom, the patience to listen to ground that others call dead. We live in a world where value is often assigned before anyone touches the soil. Land is graded, mapped, priced, and dismissed, sometimes in the span of a single surveyor's afternoon. But the Tavish farm reminds us that the experts can be wrong. Not maliciously wrong, just blind to what they aren't trained to look for. Dr. Harlan Webb was the finest geologist in the territory, and even he missed the largest shallow geothermal field in North America until a desperate homesteader with a pickaxe showed him where it was. That should humble all of us. It means that the next worthless thing might be a miracle in disguise, and the next fool everyone laughs at might be the only person who actually understands what he's holding. There's something else in this story too, something harder to talk about. Mark Tavish wasn't just clever, he was grieving. He and Lisa had buried 2 children. They came to that lava field with almost nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of small graves left behind. When you understand that, the whole narrative shifts. The steam vents weren't just an opportunity. They were a second chance to build a life that wouldn't end in frozen soil. Every cabbage leaf, every warm floorboard, every night that baby Anna slept safe and warm was a small redemption. The earth gave them heat, but they turned it into healing. Thaddeus Crane's ending is its own kind of lesson. He tried to steal a value he couldn't create, and when the scheme collapsed, he was left with nothing but the mercy of the man he'd wronged. Mark could have turned him away. Most people would have. But Mark let him stay and handed him an axe. That wasn't forgiveness born of weakness. That was the quiet confidence of a man who had already won everything that mattered. Crane spent years splitting wood on land he'd once sued to possess, and somewhere in that labor he might have learned what ownership actually means. It's not a deed in a courthouse drawer. It's calluses and cold mornings and the slow, stubborn work of making something grow where nothing grew before. So the question lingers, was Mark Tavish a genius, or was he just willing to listen when the earth whispered? Maybe the answer is both. Genius, on the frontier, often looked exactly like a man kneeling in volcanic rock at midnight, holding a lantern and believing that warmth meant something more than a geological anomaly. It looked like a boy carrying buckets of soil for a greenhouse no one else understood. It looked like a woman standing in a cabin doorway, terrified but trusting, while snow piled against a drift wall that her husband had built not with walls, but with wind and trees and a stubborn faith in the shape of broken currents. And it looked like steam rising from a clay chimney on a January morning, proof that winter had met something it couldn't kill. Today, geothermal greenhouses feed communities in cold climates around the world. The technology has advanced far beyond canvas roofs and clay chimneys, but the principle remains exactly what Mark Tavish discovered with his bare hands. The earth is alive beneath us, and it offers a warmth that doesn't require a fire. We just have to be willing to dig. Subscribe now to follow more stories of pioneers who saw what everyone else missed and who turned the impossible into home.